For today's webinar, we have Leslie Hammer from Hammer Forensics presenting Footwear Evidence Conclusions, a discussion of standards, recommendations, and structure. Without further delay, here is Leslie.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to RTI and their Forensic Center of Excellence for inviting me to conduct this webinar. I also want to thank Jenny Lounsbury from the American Society of Trace Evidence Examiners for reaching out to me to conduct this webinar. And thanks to everybody for signing on to participate. I think that this discussion about footwear evidence conclusions is a really important one, because we have in this profession little guidance on how to articulate footwear evidence conclusions. And footwear evidence conclusions are really challenging to write. I was also a latent print examiner, crime scenes, drug analyst, and writing all those reports and conclusions. I just don't remember struggling as hard as I do for footwear evidence conclusions. Our footwear evidence scale is multi-level. Our comparisons are not simple. Our results are not just straightforward. We don't just have ID and exclusion. We have a whole range. So there's an endless variety of combinations of the types of correspondence and evidence that we encounter. And yet we have this need to express conclusions in some kind of format that's recognizable across our community and for all of our different customers or readers of our reports. So I hope that this discussion is helpful in that end. The aspects I want to touch on related to this topic are the current status of conclusion scales in the United States, some suggested components for constructing a conclusion, how our reports can support conclusions, and some of the language that goes on, and we'll discuss this throughout the presentation, but we have what our findings are, and they're referred to as conclusions. Parts of them are opinions, interpretations, and results, and just kind of touch on that language. The importance of identifying the limitations in our comparisons. I'll go through some conclusion examples and discuss the kinds of words we can use to really be clear about foundations for our opinions, and touch on the research that's related to examiner conclusions. So to be clear, this presentation is going to share my practices and points of view, the way that I construct and write conclusions, and my philosophy about conclusion is based on my own influences and experiences. I did work in a crime laboratory, an accredited crime laboratory, as both a supervisor and analyst. I have worked in other disciplines besides footwear and tire tracks. I've also been a latent print examiner, crime scene examiner, analyst, and done some research in barefoot examination. So the way that all those other disciplines word their reports has influenced me. I used to be a teacher, which I'm still dedicated to education. So I definitely have a lean towards educating our customers, not just making a short statement. And you'll see that influence as we go along. I've been involved in standard development, I do a lot of instruction of examiners, and in having the opportunity to work with examiners in training, I have learned so much about not just what they struggle with, but also I've gotten so many great ideas from other examiners. So that all plays into the way that I write conclusions as well. I do private work now and have for the last decade, and have had the opportunity to have discussions with people outside of my local community. So when I worked at a laboratory, there were certain customers, like prosecutors, that I always worked with, and we were able to arrive at an understanding. They understood the work and my reports. But in dealing with people reading my reports from all over the country, that it may be the first time I'm meeting them, it's been really helpful in thinking about the ways that I articulate findings to make them clear to readers. And then also the opportunity to discuss how conclusions are done in other countries has also influenced me. So based on all that, I have a certain approach to writing my conclusions and fitting them into reports. However, this presentation is definitely not about shoulds. It's not me telling you what I think you should do. It's me sharing what I do, both so I can learn from your comments at the end and hopefully, provide some helpful discussion for you and your work. Because this is pre-recorded and we'll have the discussion at the end, I just wanted to encourage you to note your thoughts and your questions as I go through this discussion, this presentation, and make sure that you remember what your comments were for the end and be prepared to share those. So first, a discussion about conclusion scales in the United States. We currently do not have a standard that is currently published or that's recently published. And that makes this challenge difficult to write conclusions to a specific standard when there are several. We had the SWGTREAD one that was published in 2013, but the SWGs are not still functioning, so there's been no ability to keep that standard evolving with current thoughts. So that is the one that I still use I've made some adjustments in the ways that I use it, but that's the one I'll be using today, just so you know that you can find that standard if you don't have it on treadforensics.org. If you use a different standard, I still think you'll be able to relate to this discussion because standards are very similar. There's the Department of Justice Uniform Language for Testimonial Reports that's been developed in the last few years that is online at the DOJ website indicated there. And just on the next slide, we'll compare the SWGTREAD and the DOJ just for an example of how these multi-level scales have developed with different types of language. The NIST OSAC and the ASB are working on a new standard. It is in development, but it's not published yet, and hopefully it will be soon. So in our future, we may have a published standard we all could use that will be a more up-to-date one with current thinking, but right now we don't have that. So a lot of laboratories have taken it upon themselves to create their own standard, maybe accepting one of these that are published or to making their own hybrid between, say, for example, the SWGTREAD scale and their own laboratory scale. So just as an example, this is the SWGTREAD next to the Department of Justice Uniform Language Standard. And they both have identification, they both have exclusion, and they both have this level of not quite an exclusion. And then a range that in the middle of associations that are pretty similar, but they use different language. The biggest difference is this limited association versus inconclusive. And I'm going to touch on that at the end of the presentation. But just so you see, although there's a lot of different scales, or several different scales at least out there, they're more the same than they are different. For writing conclusions, do we need conclusion scales? I definitely think that we do. We need to provide a spectrum so that readers and within our community, we can have a reference point when we choose a level in a conclusion scale that can be compared and referenced when we write our conclusions, and we choose a level that someone can look at the scale and have an idea about where that level fits on that scale, both for our customers to understand the value and also within our community of examiners that we have a reference point for us to discuss the strength of evidence and come to consensus. Is it important to have one scale that's used by all? I don't know that will happen, but I do think it's important that we try to do that for the sake of consistency, not just for the readers of our report to know that there's one scale being used. When examiner performance is evaluated in studies, it really makes it difficult when people use different scales to try and figure out if there is consensus when people are using different scales. And I also think that there's an important professionalism in agreeing within a community and using the same scale. So I do hope that we do eventually have one scale that we all use. When we can't control these scale issues that we're currently experiencing, all we can do is really focus on what we write, to be very clear, to be very transparent, to lay out the foundation for our conclusion, refer to the current scale used, and then in detail explain our findings in terms of footwear characteristics, because ultimately all scales will be described in terms of what characteristics are in correspondence to achieve a certain level. So your report, if it's explained, or your conclusion is explained in terms of the footwear characteristics that were in correspondence, that finding can be translated to other scales or other scales in the future. A conclusion is really part of a report. It's a typical report has all the administrative documentation, descriptions of evidence and actions, and then a conclusion is part of the report, typically at the end, that sums up one or more comparisons. But to also be a document that educates and supports the conclusion or prepares the reader to understand a conclusion, there's some other information that we can include in a report to help with that. We can include image of the evidence. Our evidence is very visual, so images can be very educational. On those images, we can illustrate our observations. Just an example off to the right of the screen, maybe a red circle so that you can discuss damage within the forefoot, for example, on this test impression, maybe, or on this gel lift, maybe a circle around an area of advanced wear that could be discussed within the report body. A paragraph that describes what is examined in footwear evidence. So a general paragraph that says we look at shoes and impressions from a scene. We look at class characteristics that are from the manufacturing of the shoe. We look at characteristics from the use of the shoe and describe what kinds of wear, cuts, inclusions, Shalimach, etc. might be evaluated, that we compare the features from the impression of the scene and the shoe that's submitted, and then determine on a range of conclusions based on what characteristics are in correspondence, what value or strength that comparison has. It's really easy to take for granted that the readers of our report understand what the work is that we do, and often they don't. I've had some really interesting questions from people seeking out help with cases, and they'll say, so as a footwear examiner, do you study how people walked across a scene and say things about the way they walk? So there's a lot of possible thoughts people have about the work that we do. So a paragraph that defines what we do can be really helpful to the reader. And then also including a copy of the scale of conclusions that's being used. So this expanded report information working up to a conclusion might enable a reader to understand what a footwear the footwear examination entails, allows the reader to reference the conclusion scale being used so they understand on that scale where that strength of evidence fits in that particular comparison, allows the reader to visualize evidence and the features being discussed. And there's a lot of ways to achieve this. Maybe this information is within the body of the report. Maybe it's provided as attachments. Maybe it's even provided as links on your laboratory website. So a lot of ways to achieve this, but providing that information that helps a reader understand the work really helps their understanding of a conclusion. So here are the components of a conclusion that I've defined, that I use to reference when I'm writing conclusions, that I use when I'm teaching examiners. I came up with this list as a double check for myself and to help when I'm trying to explain how conclusions should be written. So again, this isn't a list that I'm suggesting goes into your procedures, but hopefully maybe it'll be helpful if you haven't seen it before. So within that paragraph or two that's considered a conclusion, these are the 6 components that I try to make sure that I address for every comparison. Restate the evidence being compared, so make it clear what impression and what outsole this conclusion is referencing. State any limitations or issues with the evidence, and I shouldn't say any limitations, the significant limitations. So your notes may address a lot of small issues with the evidence, but if there's a large issue like no scale that affected the conclusion you were able to arrive at, that should be restated in the conclusion. Describing the correspondence that was found in terms of the footwear characteristics. So what specific characteristics, both from manufacturing or class and from use, were found to correspond in this case should be listed. State the scale level then that the evidence warranted and that you chose. State your opinion involved in the evidence or in the conclusion. At the point that you're making an opinion, and I have identified the opinion that I'm giving as the part when I state whether or not I think that the footwear was or could have been or was not the source of the impression as my opinion. And then make sure to acknowledge that there's other possible sources if it's an inclusion and not an identification or exclusion. So a conclusion really should stand alone and be complete. We know the readers of our reports usually go right to a conclusion and read it, but your report, if they go back and read it, could help them support when they reread the conclusion. Definitely should stand alone and be clear what evidence and what the findings were and what the opinion and level is, and that there are other sources if appropriate. So we're going to go through some examples in just a minute, and I'll come back to all those 6 things and not address them all for every example, but address aspects of those. So we'll come to that in just a minute. But before we get there, I wanted to just go back to this idea for our findings, that there's different aspects of our findings. And if you work in an accredited laboratory, there was this expectation in accreditation that a report acknowledges that there are opinions, interpretations, results, but I haven't necessarily seen examples of these specific words being attached to, say, a specific sentence, more like an overall statement. This report includes these. I've been involved with some discussions that may see us move towards using these specific words or calling out aspects, particular statements in our report that fit one of these definitions. I have been using the word opinion in my conclusion, in a part of my conclusion, consistency, for quite a few years now, but I don't use these other words. So maybe some of you do, and we'll have some good feedback on that. But I want to acknowledge that this language is something I think our community still could use a lot of discussion on, and we may see evolve to be more called out in our conclusions in the future. So we'll go through some examples. I'm not going to address each 6 steps for every example. And I also want to make clear that the language that I'm using that will be in italics is not language I'm suggesting that is exactly like the language you would use in a conclusion. It's meant to just address the types of features, the types of language, the types of comments that we might make might be helpful to a conclusion and to the understanding of to the reader. So this first example is just a classic design and size of in snow, fairly limited detail. So the first part, which I won't address again in any of the other examples, but just to that first part where making clear the evidence is being what evidence we're discussing, a quick statement that says image of impression in the snow, S1 was compared to the right boot, B2. Limitations, the impression S1 lacked detail in portions of the heel and forefoot. No cast was submitted or only a photograph was used in this evaluation. We know we mostly get only photographs in this line of work, but we also know that it's recommended that for any 3-dimensional impression that they're also cast. And that is a limitation in some cases. So if you thought so, and that affected your results, then that's something you can mention, an example of something you might mention as a limitation. So the part that discusses the correspondence found in terms of characteristics. The outsole design and physical size of the right boot, B2, was found to correspond to the features depicted in the photograph of the impression, S1. So design and size were found to correspond. This is an association of class characteristics on the SWGTREAD scale of conclusions. So a statement that makes it clear what level is being assigned and what conclusion scale is being used. The opinion portion. In my opinion, and that should say right boot, sorry about that, B2 could have made the impression. And then that there are other sources, that this is an inclusion, meaning it's part of a population of shoes that could have made the impression, that any shoes that share the same design and physical size as those features present. So that acknowledges that there are some missing components of the impression, could also be a possible source of this impression. And then what if we don't have a scale, for example? So what if this same impression didn't have a scale? Then the limitation would include that lack of reliable scale in the image. And the correspondence found, for example, may be that the pattern correspond to the design, but that the physical size could not be completely evaluated because there's no scale. And then this might be considered to be a limited association of class characteristics in your examination on the SWGTREAD scale of conclusions. And then the other sources could have the same design, but they might be a different size. And there's a number of ways to acknowledge that, but that would be the population of other shoes. Now, with an impression like this, there could be a big research project that involves manufacturers where you could figure out the size based on design, but that often isn't, we don't have the time or the resources to do that in cases. So it's important to acknowledge, though, that lack of that population of possible sources could be of any size. Another example, this being a detailed impression where we can see texturing. So the correspondence found would include size, design, and texturing, but since it's a partial, it would be to a portion of the forefoot of the right outsole. In addition, if there's enough detail for texturing, maybe the condition, whether it's new or some wear, could be also found to correspond. It might be an association of class or maybe a limited association, depending on how you feel about partials. In my opinion, it could have been made by the submitted right shoe. And other possible sources now is different. It would be size, design, and the same texturing and possibly the same condition, depending on your evaluation. Another example might be a high degree or ID. So some of the language that would change if we have a lot more evidence of damage or detail from use. So we would discuss design, physical size, wear, possibly texturing, and then describe the damage. Numerous cuts and other areas of damage were found to correspond to voids present in the impression. Now, the opinion statement for a high degree, or ID, I really struggle and change my language, so I don't have a solid recommendation. I'd like to hear from you what kind of language you use. If you do an opinion statement, do you say, I think this is the shoe that made it, or was the source, or likely, or highly likely? What kind of language? I really have changed that, and I don't run into IDs. Most of my private work for the last decade has been really low quality impressions, so it's not something I run into often, and something I'm still developing. So yes, would like to hear for your thoughts on that language. When it comes to the other sources statement, now since we can't put a number on our population of other sources for any of these examples. And in all these examples, we've done the same thing. We've described the population of other sources. So for another outsole to be considered a possible source of this impression, it would have to share the same design, physical size, texturing, which means it comes from the same mold, wear, mold or mold source, wear, and have the same damage and the same position and orientation on the outsole. So in itself, just that description, any reader can understand that there are not very many shoes, if any, that would meet those conditions. So just as a review of the components of a conclusion, I've reposted these 6 steps just so you can take a look at them again. And I know that that was a pretty quick run through of some language, but again, it wasn't for those specific statements exactly the way they're used, but just to reiterate that making clear what evidence is compared, stating significant issues that influence the evidence, describing the correspondence that was found in terms of footwear characteristics, clearly stating the scale and the level that was assigned, stating the opinion that you think it was made, wasn't made, could have been made, and including, very important to include the possibility of other sources. So a lot of ways to make those statements. If all those things are included, it is a conclusion that stands alone and is providing the foundation for the opinion, and clearly the opinion and the limitations involved, as well as acknowledging, if it's not an identification, that there are other possible sources. So some other conclusion related topics that are important, and I just wanted to address these more to spur discussion. I don't have the answers to these, but to just bring up some of the discussions that are going on. So using statistics and conclusions, I definitely am in support of statistics and think that they have so much value in our work. In footwear evidence, it's not about, is there a calculation so much? Is there a calculation that's valid? It's what database would be used to input information about, into that calculation. So to come up with a relevant database in footwear is such a compounded, difficult question. Not only are new outsoles coming out all the time that would have to be included, but footwear varies so drastically in different areas of the country. What might be a rare shoe in Anchorage, Alaska is going to be very different than what's a rare shoe in Kona, Hawaii. So coming up with relevant databases is really what is the holdup in us as footwear examiners being able to look toward using valid statistics anytime soon. But it's still a pursuit, and definitely a discussion that needs to keep happening, and resources keep needing to go into. The topic of inconclusive is a really interesting one, and I think this is a discussion we should have sooner rather than later, since it's being used by some and not used by some, and what inconclusive means, how it should be used, what types of evidence fit into these categories. I think this could be a real point of confusion across our country when some labs are using inconclusive and some aren't. I don't use it, but I'm not suggesting that that's the way it should go forward. I've heard a lot of really good arguments for it. So that is something I'd like to see us come to consensus on for sure when a new standard is developed. And identification, that level, any of us in pattern evidence know that identification is a topic that gets challenged, whether or not sole source is a scientific, conclusion to be made. I do think that we may see identification going away. That's a possibility, one that we should think about and discuss and really thoroughly vet all of the ramifications of that. For me personally, I don't worry too much about that. I think we are fortunate as footwear evidence examiners in that our evidence is so demonstrable and visual, and people can picture it, that if you describe as an examiner all of the features that you are using in what would be an identification level comparison, it will really stand for itself. And I think anybody can understand that by the time you have all of the class correspondence and then all, a wealth of damage that's all in correspondence, that the chance that would occur on a different shoe is extremely minute. There are not a lot of research projects that have been done for footwear examiner conclusions, so it's good to be aware of the ones that are out there. The first three listed there have been around for quite a while, and you are probably familiar with. The ones in the box, the yellow box, are 3 papers that just came out in November of 2020, a study done by University of West Virginia. I was fortunate enough to be the subject matter expert in those studies. Dr. Jacqueline Spear and Dr. Nicole Riccitelli are absolutely brilliant, and they were just amazing to work with. These 3 papers were primarily written by them, and they are so thorough and well thought out, and quite challenging to read if you haven't read them, I definitely encourage you to. I'm working on a 4th paper related to this same study that will be published in the Journal of Forensic Identification, geared towards footwear examiners and what parts of this research we can take and apply to our work, to the development of scales, to training. I am in the midst of working on that. I do want to complete it by the end of the year. So I'd say in the next 6 months or so that might be out. But it's important to really look at this research and be familiar with it yourself. My personal feeling after reading all this and being involved with at least the last 2 studies are that we are, as a community, accurate, and we are in consensus for the most part. When I look at results that have come in on these studies, I feel that it's not so much examiners when they choose a different level on the scale, it's not because they saw different characteristics or found different features and correspondence, it's because they may just choose a different level on the scale. And when there's a line between levels, like limited association and association, and they're only generally defined, of course, we are going to choose in a particular case that might lay right on that dividing line. Some people will fall to one side or another, and I don't see that as an error or as a problem. It's kind of an inherent result of having a spectrum scale. So that's a whole discussion in itself, but I think if you read these studies, 1, you should be aware of them, and 2, that you will have confidence in what we do, but also see the need for continued discussions to arrive at a consensus way that scales are used. So some summary thoughts. It's important for our community to keep working on these discussions toward a unified scale and uniform ways to articulate our conclusions. And to date, reliable databases are what limits us to be able to calculate probabilities that are accurate for our footwear evidence conclusions. With those challenges, meanwhile, and the challenges of not having a uniform standard, it's just important to work at a real clear statement and a complete view of our examination in writing and basis for our opinions and our conclusions, so that they're well understood and can stand both being compared to other scales and scales that are developed in the future. As far as a footwear examiner, what can we do to aid in clear conclusion writing in our profession? We can become involved in the standard development process. So getting involved with the OSAC Footwear and Tire Track Committee and/or the ASB committees. If you want more information about that, please, my email will be at the end. I'm happy to connect you with people. At least staying apprised of when documents are posted for comment. That's extremely important to weigh in on the documents that are being created and how you feel about them and how they're going to work for you in your profession. To work towards laboratory agreement on levels and test agreement with that of other labs. So meanwhile, until we have a uniform standard, it's really worth your time to even use mock cases and see within your laboratory how much consensus you have on what levels you choose for particular cases, and then reach out to other laboratories, either using the same scale, which makes it straightforward to compare, or maybe ones that use a different scale to see how would that information transfer. But that outreach to see how your work and your decisions are weighing and fit within other community decisions is an effort worth your time. One of the most important pieces of advice that I think I can give for writing conclusions is to write a conclusion in a mock case or take a conclusion out of a real case and test it on the types of people that read our reports. So have an attorney read it, an investigator, even people in your family. I make my family members read my conclusions all the time and ask them, what do you think I'm saying? And it is so educational for us as examiners to hear how what we're saying is being interpreted. That has really influenced the way that I write conclusions, and I really suggest that you do that. You get so much knowledge from doing that. And of course, reading the research, keeping up to date, especially related to conclusions, so that you can realize that we are reliable and have a lot of consensus, but of course we aren't perfect, as if that were a possibility. But being able to have some understanding and knowledge of the types of research that supports what we do is important, and supports our thoughts, and how we choose a level on a scale is important. So I hope you can take the parts of this presentation that might be helpful and add them to what you do. I hope you found something helpful within this discussion, and I certainly look forward to this next part, which is where you have comments and questions. This is my contact information, hammer.forensics@gmail.com. If I can provide any more information or any of the links, etc., in the slideshow, don't hesitate to contact me. And now we will move on to the time for comments and questions.
All right. Thank you, Leslie, for a fantastic and informative presentation. Let's go ahead and get right into some questions from the audience. First one I have here is, what do you think will be the effect of the OSAC standards regarding footwear examination conclusions on the other existing standards?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for those questions. I can see them coming in. I've been madly taking notes, so hopefully we can get to those topics. Addressing this first one, I see that David Canaris, who's heading that group, is online, so that's great. I'm sure he'd have some things to add, but I think that's still very much in process. I think that the more that we all participate, the better, because having input to how a new standard comes out that affects all of us is really important. So I think we'll see it address some of these questions we have about using statistics and about whether or not we include identification and those types of questions. But David, feel free to chime in, but I believe that is still a work in progress, and will be, although I know they're working very hard to get it out as soon as possible.
Actually have another one here that's in the same vein. Has the 2016 PCAST report affected your report content, and particularly your conclusion language?
That's a really good question. I don't think it changed my conclusions much. It, in a way, supported, I think, some of the approaches and challenges with writing conclusions in footwear evidence. It did really spur on a lot of research in the area of conclusions, which I think has been a big bonus.
Awesome. Thank you. Next question I have here is, what are examples of interpretations that are made in footwear examinations?
This is just me, and I've only really given this thought recently, but I think the most interpretations, the most appropriate part of the examination, I think, that fits that term is when we're looking at a crime scene impression and we are looking at shapes or voids or features, and we're interpreting those as what they were made by, so what they correspond to on a footwear outsole. But I think that discussion really needs to happen with the whole community.
Makes sense. Absolutely. Next question I have here, could you please go into greater depth as to including images of question impressions and known exemplars in your report? Do you have any examples that you could share?
I don't have a way to put examples up right now, and I actually struggle with that because my examples are reports that are, I don't have permission to share. That's something about private work. It's very difficult to get permission to share reports. I would say that it's different for each case. So taking what you think are the most important visual aspects of your case and putting whether you think it's important to show just the unknown or the unknown, say gel lift next to the test impression so that you can circle using the same color from one to the other, with tires. This is a footwear presentation, but a lot of arrows that show, different features in a tread pattern. Yeah, that I don't know if that's very helpful or not, but what I would like to do is construct an example that doesn't have anything that's a report. I do have one like that, but I don't think it's what you're after. It's a good question. It would be nice to have a bunch of examples of that we could post somewhere. That treadforensics.org is such a resource that might be a good place to do that. I'll take that into consideration. I think that would be helpful to have. Awesome.
Another question I have here, is it important to write a long conclusion for an identification when a short statement like the right boot X made the impression Y would be more to the point?
Oh, that question has a lot of value when it comes to our communication, our clarity. I know when I was first taught to write conclusions, we had a very short statement, just the footwear X made the impression Y. And I felt at the time that was such a clear, direct statement. It really felt like planting a flag and sending that out. And what I got back was that they had the readers, had no idea what that meant. They'd say, does this mean you think it made it, or it's pretty sure? So I think that sticking for IDs with that longer explanation just really drives home all of the items that you have in correspondence and gives much more of a visual picture of the evidence.
Understood. Another question I have here, when critically cross-examined on the actual meaning of terms like likely or highly likely, how do you respond?
I actually haven't used likely or highly likely. I threw those out for discussion. Unfortunately, at least in my experience, we don't go to court often enough to have one good way to respond. A lot of it is kind of what you say in the moment. I think to answer that question, I was madly taking notes as comments were going by about the different language that people use. So I think this would be a good point to just summarize some of those, and apologies to anybody if I am misinterpreting what you wrote. But what I pulled out of a lot of the shares that were happening in the chat was the language that's the part where we are saying what we think. So there's a way to say it that's my opinion, or there's a way to say it that's a little more removed. Let me give some examples to make this point. So some of the language that came through was for an identification or highly likely that we would not expect to see those same, that level of correspondence. There's enough correspondence to indicate that the shoe made the impression. There's enough correspondence to conclude an identification. And that's interesting language, all saying the same thing, but it's really good examples of how we're saying things in so many different ways. Now that language is saying, it's not directly saying it's my opinion that, it's saying that by some set of guidelines, this evidence warrants a highly or a high degree or an identification. And then other parts of statements that were shared, that it was made, that it was the source. So there is a lot of different language being used, and therefore that question about court is very valid, one we should all think about, because that language that you choose to use, you very well could end up defending in court. One comment that was shared, or practice for reports that was shared, was including this statement with an identification that it was the source, wouldn't expect to see all these features in agreement, but it can never be empirically proven. And that's an interesting statement. I appreciate all those shares. I think they're all really, really great feedback and great for us to all think about how we might include them. And as was brought up, how would you defend that in court? And back to me about that, the last time I defended an identification in court, I felt that having the visuals, having be able to go back and forth with all of the, again, the size, design, and all of the damage that was in correspondence was really what provided the strength of the evidence, not so much what words I used in the statement.
Kind of shifting back over to the exam factors with this question. I have one here that's looking for your thoughts on how the verification or re-examination phase of the exam factors into the final conclusion, or is that not assessed in research projects?
It hasn't been in a part of the ones that I've been involved in. I don't offhand think it was part of any of those that I listed. And it's a really good point. And one, if you're ever questioned on the research, is all the research projects that we have on conclusions of examiners are of individual examiners. And that whole question of how the verification process would increase the reliability is one we need a research project on for sure.
Awesome. Thank you. Just going to send a reminder out to the audience to feel free to continue sending in any questions. We're getting to the end of our list here and we still have plenty of time. So please do not hesitate to send things in for Leslie to answer. The next question I have up here is what should a lab do that has only standard paragraphs of conclusion language to choose from? Like one paragraph for each level of conclusion on the scale.
This question comes up a lot when I'm doing training, a laboratory system. So many labs have gone to LIMS systems that also generate reports that some of them have standard paragraphs. I think it's well meant in terms of creating some standard language, but unfortunately, and it depends. I've seen different approaches to this, but I'll just, as an exaggeration, if there is only one paragraph for each level on the conclusion scale, it really wouldn't fit the evidence most of the time, because within each conclusion scale, within each conclusion level, there's a range of different types of correspondence that can occur. So the danger of using pat or pre-written paragraphs is that they don't fit the evidence. And I believe our responsibility is to be as clear and complete as possible. So I understand the intent doing that, and I understand the practicality of doing that, but unfortunately, I think it doesn't fit with being transparent and accurate.
Totally makes sense. Next question I have here. Can you maybe comment on how you report out on the processing results and complexity of the examinations?
I'm not sure I'm understanding what's being asked there. I don't specifically address the complexity other than in just the ways that I've shared, where discussing what was found in correspondence. I may not be understanding what that question is asking.
We'll have the question answer maybe circle back around. Yeah, okay. And clarify. I do have another question here. Do you think that the characteristics point system should be used to support source identification or the scale?
Will you read the first part of that one again?
Apologies,
point.
Probably speaking a little too quickly here. Do you think that the characteristics point system should be used to support source identification or the scale?
If I'm understanding that one, it's some kind of counting of points, which as a fingerprint examiner, we can do a little easier, although there's issues with that as well. But fingerprint examiners usually will discuss routinely, there were so many points in an identification. In footwear, that doesn't translate as easily because you might have one pinpoint piece of damage, or you might have one big rip that has so many irregular edges and sides to it that it doesn't really describe the evidence to use a point system. So I don't in footwear evidence use a point system at all.
Question here. Do you think that some of these issues might be resolved by the use of pattern jury instructions reading? Like, for example, and they provide an example when an expert in the field of whatever it may be uses whatever term that expert means, some of those type of instructions.
That's interesting thought. I think we have such a huge gap in understanding between what we do and what judges understand or what attorneys understand. I've had some of the most interesting conversations in my career that are really shocking to me. What is and is not understood. As basic as that we even have standards, or that a footwear examiner is a profession. So our gap in understanding is so large that yes, any move towards decreasing that gap to the point that there could be something that's read all over the country that explains pattern evidence anything that helps increase the knowledge across the country as it's used in court, I would definitely support, as long as it's constructed with input by the examination community.
Fair point. Absolutely. Another question we have coming in: have you ever reported a stronger association conclusion than what your verifier reached?
I have not. To me, the verification process is really important to come out the other end with a consensus opinion. So in my experience, if there's two examiners that after all the conversations have been moderated, still have one higher than the other, it would be my tendency to go with the lower conclusion and stay more conservative.
All right, I think we got our last question here, and it's a simple one, hopefully. Could you provide the brand and make of the shoe that was used in the presentation earlier, the one that was the snow impression without the scale, or with and without the scale?
Oh, I would have to go back and look. That was one created for mock cases that I trained. So I have so many of those, I couldn't tell you offhand, but I can see if I have that if you want to email me individually. Perfect.
And with that, we'll actually start wrapping things up and show your email and contact information on the screen here now. And also just want to thank you for taking the time out of your day and presenting the material for today's webinar. So again, thank you, Leslie, for taking that time and providing such a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Tom. You're a great host, and everybody, thank you so much for signing in. And I know we didn't catch all the questions, so if there's any continued conversation you want to have, please feel free to email me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leslie. And for everybody in the audience, we have not only Leslie's contact information at the top, but we also have a couple of the different links that were shown earlier in the presentation. Those and more are actually on the main page for the webinar, the page that you were at before you came in and actually are viewing this screen. So feel free at any time to go back and use those links to get to these different websites. We would also like to take this time to thank our audience for joining us today. These webinars would not be possible without your attendance and support. Before you leave today's webinar, we would like to ask you to participate in a short survey. You can locate that link back on the webinar's main page. Simply click the word survey, and that will bring up our quick customer satisfaction survey for today's event. Your feedback about our webinars is vital information that we use to provide you with the best webinar experience and adjust the content and the way we disseminate the information to our audience. One more thing to draw your attention to, you should see we are putting links into the chat to all our social media pages, such as Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, as well as a link to our website at forensiccoe.org and a link directly to our podcast episodes. Make sure you are following us on social media and subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date with everything that FTCOE is doing in the forensic community. Thank you again for attending, and we hope everyone has a great rest of your day.